I'm not saying you should toss out the market theories. I'm not saying you should stop looking at economics or the economy. Quite the contrary. They are one set of ideas as part of the whole, but not the only ones.
Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. It's an audio version of what you can find on public television, where I analyze global topics, sit down with big guests, and make use of little puppets. This week I sit down with Gillian Tett. She's chairman of the editorial board and editor-at-large for the United States at the Financial Times. Gillian was an early predictor of the 2008 financial crisis and a great person to talk to about the state of the global economy today. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
And I have Gillian Tett, who is the head of the editorial board here at the United States Financial Times. Good to see you again.
Great to be on your show.
You know, we always say that we value what we measure, right? Are we measuring the right things? If you could wave a wand and have us pay attention to different numbers or numbers that we don't have right now but we should have, what would they be?
I think the fundamental problem today is economists do a great job of measuring things that have a monetary value. So they look at widgets, how many widgets does the factory produce and what do they sell it for? They look at how much you spend in terms of consumption. They look at prices. They look at all these elements measured with money. And one of the problems today is that a significant chunk of our tech economy, the innovation economy, is not based on monetary exchanges, but essentially barter. And by that I mean that consumers are getting a whole avalanche of free services, supposedly free services from tech companies, which are incredibly important for their consumption patterns, for their productivity and how they live their lives, for their economic activity. Mm-hmm. They're not paying money for that. They're essentially paying by giving up data. And there's a swap of data for services, which is not actually being mediated by money at all. So that goes entirely uncounted in the statistics that the economists collect.
How should it be counted?
Well, I think you need to recognize that there's a transaction going on which cannot be measured with numbers alone, and start to realize that barter is actually a very powerful lens to look at the economy today. And there needs to be a lot of discussion about what we're missing as a result of ignoring barter trade.
Now,
and that impacts into how you measure, how you look at issues like antitrust, monopoly, power of tech companies, et cetera, et cetera.
Leaving the regulatory side for a moment, if you were to include all of that barter in the way you think about a country's economic robustness, its GDP, would that then make you feel differently about productivity? Would it make you say, wait a second, there's a lot more going on in this economy than we thought there was?
I think that it would certainly make the productivity numbers look more convincing if you could find a way to measure that. I think it also raised questions about this issue of what's happening to prices, consumer prices, because this barter, in a sense, is a way of providing services on an expanding scale without actually directly impacting consumer prices, and yet it may be one factor that's actually helping to suppress consumer prices more broadly.
Now, the other side, which you just mentioned, was the regulatory aspect. If you don't actually consider that this is a part of monopoly power because it's not considered a part of the value that the company is driving, what does that make you think about how they should be regulated?
Well, the issue more at stake is more that for the last few decades, regulators in Washington have determined whether a monopoly exists or not on the basis of what it's doing to consumer prices. So if consumer prices are essentially being artificially pushed up, they assume there's a monopoly that's essentially screwing consumers.
But if consumer prices are zero?
If consumer prices aren't actually there, available, then you need to start rethinking your concept of monopolies. The good news is that debate is now starting to be had, but frankly, it's quite late in the day.
Who's having that debate right now?
Well, inside the FTC, there is now discussion around that, and it's also starting to seep into the political landscape as well. So on the Hill, you do finally have politicians saying, let's start looking at these big companies and see whether they are indeed screwing consumers. And in my mind, the issue at stake is this, that once you recognize that there is a massive barter trade going on, and that actually it's not the case that consumers are being entirely taken advantage of by tech companies taking their data. They're getting something back.
They are.
Once you shift it away from the indignant, angry argument of they're just taking our data, that's terrible, to actually there's a barter trade going on, then you ask, well, can we reset the terms of the barter trade in a way that looks fairer to everybody? Should it be much more transparent about what's being given and what's being received? Should there be more options in the market for who you want to barter with? It begins to put it on a more, in some ways, emotionally neutral platform, and perhaps more effective one as well.
How do you compete with free?
Well, if everyone's essentially dealing with free, and free is barter right now, then actually it becomes about the terms of trade. How do you structure that trade?
So it's so interesting. When we talk on this show, for example, about climate, you have an entire conversation that the market mechanisms are not able to function the way they should because there's no price. And in here I hear you saying the same thing with a completely different perspective. We're talking about the way that consumers are getting some of the most important services they presently receive. How far out of whack is the capitalist model because it doesn't have the ability to respond to fundamental changes in the marketplace?
Well, here's another way of looking at this, which is this, and that, I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, and anthropologists tend to look at everything holistically and spend as much time thinking about what people aren't talking about as what they are talking about. And there's a school of anthropology called economic anthropology, which always looks at the market as simply one facet of the systems of exchanges that bind a society together. So instead of talking about just the economy or the monetary transactions, you look at the world in terms of exchanges in the wider sense, and that includes credit, money, and barter altogether. And if you take that view, then you accept that actually the market has a role to play, but it's not the only role to play in terms of creating exchanges that bind society together. The problem is that many economists are trained to assume that the market is pretty much the only mechanism or the only really important platform for those exchanges, and that monetary transactions are the only transactions that matter. So in some ways, I'm not saying you should toss out the market theories. I'm not saying you should stop looking at economics or the economy, quite the contrary. But it's a bit like saying, to somebody in the Catholic Church in the medieval era, don't just assume that that priestly class who seem so powerful and important because they happen to speak Latin and they know the Catholic Church better than everyone else and run it, automatically run everything. They are one set of ideas as part of the whole, but not the only ones.
Okay, I didn't know you were going to medieval Catholicism, but we're fine with that. Another thing where we measure a piece, and I've wanted to ask you about this, is the deficit. We talk a lot about the deficit in the United States. I've always wondered, and when you talk about corporations, you look at their balance sheet, you look at the assets as well as the liabilities. And yet when we talk about the United States and we talk about sovereigns, countries, you talk about their debt, and that's it, right? Does that affect the way you think about the debate when we talk about a massive deficit spending in the United States?
Well, there's two levels of that question, which is, firstly, there's a question of whether you're looking at net debt or gross debt. And obviously, the net debt is actually, you take the gross number and you basically square it off against the immediate source of revenue and assets the government holds. The second question, though, is whether you look at the wider range of assets the government holds, which are not being properly counted or measured. And there are a lot of those. I mean, there are some people advocating for looking at, say, all of the property and real estate that the American government owns and saying, couldn't you manage that much more effectively and actually realize value that way? Doug Detter, a Swedish economist, has advanced those ideas a lot. The problem is that when you start going down that route and saying, well, actually, there's a lot of value you can unlock through a government's assets that make the debt look less scary, you then start to say, well, actually, there's also a lot of unrealized liabilities that are not measured on that deficit figure either, to do with pensions, healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those liabilities for the future. So it's a slightly nebulous picture. So it is very important, yes, to look at the unmeasured assets and the unmeasured liabilities. But it's also important to recognize that you can start arguing about that for a long time. At the end of the day, the markets tend to look much more at the net debt figure, rather than the gross debt figure, but not the widest one of all.
Now, the ultimate belief in such a system, and something you write about a lot, is the strength of the dollar. You've been someone who's been pretty consistently bullish in the belief that the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency is not something that's under particular threat right now.
Given your concerns about the growing lack of social cohesion in the U.S., at what point does that start to change, if at all, in your view?
There's a push and a pull factor with the dollar right now. On the one hand, there is no alternative to the dollar on the global stage, and it's quite hard to see when that's going to emerge, at least if you look at it in terms of other nation states or regions, because although there was tremendous excitement about the euro when that was first launched, the Eurozone remains beset by problems in the fractious political economy. And the Chinese right now show absolutely no ability or readiness to really liberalize their capital account and current account in a way that would make the Chinese currency a proper rival reserve currency. So almost by default, or almost by virtue of an ugly contest, not a beauty contest, the dollar is currently in a prime position. The other side of the equation, though, is the American economy has been growing a lot stronger. And thus far, at least, no matter what you think about the travails of the political world in Washington, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, still commands a considerable amount of respect. And they have performed creditably in recent years. So unless that changes, I think there's going to be quite a lot supporting the dollar for the moment. But the real question is that, in this world of ugly contests, not beauty contests, is it possible that actually the real threat will come from some form of alternative, like a digital currency or cryptocurrency or something outside central banks? And that is maybe a more interesting question looking at the medium term.
Now, we have seen the Chinese start to dump a small amount of U.S. treasuries over the past few months, coming at the same time that the U.S.-China trade deal appears less likely to get done. Is that in any way an early warning that some of the credibility that you talk about with the Fed, even in the absence of alternatives, could be eroding? Or is it noise and the Chinese can't do anything no matter what?
I don't think the Chinese will be dumping those treasuries right now as a sign of loss of credit, loss of belief in the Fed. It's probably a small political signal, and it's probably also tied to the management of reserves as well. But it certainly indicates that there is this tremendous imbalance right now, which is that the Chinese have not just been exporting a lot to the US, but they've also been essentially gobbling up treasuries left, right, and center. And they're not the only ones. So that's definitely a risk. Now, what's very interesting, though, is if you look at the data on who owns treasuries, you've seen quite a significant shift in the last 4 or 5 years, where you had this great growth in foreign holdings of treasuries, the Chinese and Japanese, a decade ago. But since then, you've had a tremendous growth in domestic holdings of treasuries. And it seems that at the moment, partly because of a lack of alternatives, of things to buy, partly because of a general safety concern, partly because of regulatory pressure on banks, the domestic demand for treasuries is certainly strong enough to keep yields very low.
So 2.5+ years of a Trump administration saying we're going to squeeze, we're going to hit other countries. A lot of people saying we don't like that, massive social dislocation sensibility in the US, all these divides. But the reality economically is that not only is the strength of the dollar what it was, but the robustness of the American balance sheet, from your perspective, no market impact.
Yeah, I mean, you have to realize that one of the things about America that makes it a bit of an outlier on the world stage is its very low dependency on trade and exports as part of its overall GDP. I mean, it's much lower than almost any other major economy. So to a certain extent, America can weather a trade war better than many of its rivals. Doesn't mean that it won't be very painful. But, the American economy has continued to grow. But that's also because there has been a bit of a sugar high with cheap money.
Does that imply that the use of tariffs, specifically tariffs, as a weapon to get other countries to do what the Americans want is actually one of the most effective asymmetric economic weapons the Americans have?
It's certainly one of the more effective weapons than they have than the other weapons that have been tried in recent years. They're going through the WTO. The irony, of course, is that it hurts American companies quite often, but that's not necessarily the same as the overarching economy in terms of relative pain compared to other countries. For what it's worth, I'm in a camp that thinks that tariffs is a rather clumsy, crude tool. I'm very much in the free trade camp, but
You do work for the Financial Times.
Yep,
yes.
well, I happen to think that globalization is a good thing, but there we go.
No, but the imposition of tariffs aren't necessarily because you want tariffs to go up. They're also potentially because you want to beat the other country down. And I guess I'm just asking that if you believe that the Americans are much less vulnerable to tariff hikes and a trade war, and if you want to get other countries to a better place from your perspective, is that effective? So, again,
well, the issue right now is that the president is using tariffs in a pretty unpredictable way that is, from his point of view, very effective because it's keeping all his enemies imbalanced and uncertain. The problem is, of course, it's keeping business imbalanced and uncertain as well. And that's where you could begin to feel some of the backlash and pressure from corporate America. But thus far, that backlash and pressure hasn't been strong enough to seriously change course.
I want to move to someplace completely different now, something you've been looking at recently, which is the issue that political parties in democratic countries are increasingly ineffective and maybe even going away. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at what's happened in the UK recently with the European elections, what you've seen is the collapse of the traditional Conservative and Labour Party quite dramatically. That doesn't just reflect the Brexit issue, although it's been fueled by it and fanned by it. It reflects a pattern you see right across Europe right now, which is that traditional parties are suffering. And you can say, well, that's just a case of anti-establishment feelings. You can say that's a case of the right rising or the left rising. Or you can stop and say, well, actually, almost every other area of our life has been disrupted by technology in the last couple of decades. Maybe politics is essentially being disrupted too. Well, the problem is that political parties today are like the political equivalent of albums in the market. They are preset packages decided by people in the 20th century. And millennials care about issues. They care about ideas. They care about celebrity brands. It's all pick and mix politics. They don't want to be...
Brexit Party, for example.
Brexit Party.
A single issue
Exactly.
party around one. Can we call him a political celebrity?
Well, you have Brexits, you have Greens.
Yes.
You have celebrity politicians. You have comedians in Italy.
The Five-Star Movement, yes.
The only politician who's actually carved out a centrist, technocratic platform
Emmanuel Macron.
is Macron, who basically created his own party, his own pick-and-mix party.
Exactly.
So,
And hasn't done very well with it.
well, but that's how he won an election, on a pick-and-mix party.
Yes.
Donald Trump essentially has pick-and-mix politics. Is he Republican or Democrat? Who the hell knows?
So what does this say to you about the Democrats in 2020 and what's likely to work?
Well, if they want to appeal to voters and get momentum, they need to have basically a pick-and-mix celebrity, a pick-and-mix idea.
AOC is too young.
She is too young, but she actually is the only person who challenges Donald Trump in terms of social media usage and actually understands as well.
Gillian Tett, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week, same place, same time, unless you're watching on social media, in which case it's wherever you happen to be. Don't miss it. In the meantime, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.